In the autumn of 1944, as the war dragged on and Germany's armies bled on every front, ordinary soldiers began to witness something that shattered their spirit. From the hedgerows of France to the ruined roads of Belgium, endless lines of American trucks roared past, stretching farther than the eye could see. Each one was loaded with fuel, food, and weapons, an unstoppable flood of resources that seemed to have no end. German soldiers, worn down by empty fuel tanks and rationed bread, stood frozen in disbelief. To them, it felt impossible. How could America summon this endless ocean of supplies while the Reich starved? For the first time, many realized they were not fighting just an army, but an industrial giant that could not be exhausted. The sight of America's infinite convoys was more terrifying than any weapon. It was the vision of inevitable defeat. By 1944, the tide of World War II had shifted irreversibly. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy, and with every passing week, American forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe. Yet what truly astonished German soldiers was not just the firepower of the enemy, but the invisible force that made it all possible: logistics. Germany's war machine, once feared for its speed and precision, was now strangled by fuel shortages. Panzer divisions sat idle, Luftwaffe squadrons remained grounded, and infantrymen marched on empty stomachs. Every liter of fuel was guarded like gold, every crumb of bread stretched thin. In stark contrast, the Americans seemed to conjure endless convoys out of thin air. Truck after truck, mile after mile, thundered across European roads in an unbroken chain of supplies. To the weary German soldier, it felt like an invasion of machines, an industrial juggernaut that could not be stopped. For the Reich's defenders, this was more than a tactical problem, it was a psychological collapse. Watching America's infinite supply lines, many began to understand a painful truth: no matter how bravely they fought, they were doomed to lose against an enemy whose greatest weapon was not the gun, but the convoy. By 1944, Germany's greatest weakness was no longer manpower or weapons, it was fuel. What had once been a carefully managed lifeline of the Reich had now shrunk into a desperate trickle. The German war machine that had thundered across Europe in the early years, powered by panzers, trucks, and the feared Luftwaffe, was slowly grinding to a halt. Everywhere, soldiers felt the suffocating weight of shortages. Tank crews who had trained for lightning strikes found themselves ordered to abandon their machines, simply because there was no fuel left to move them. Luftwaffe pilots, once the masters of Europe's skies, sat idle as their aircraft were grounded, engines dry and useless. Infantry units marched until their boots wore through, because trucks could no longer be spared for their transport. The mighty blitzkrieg, which had terrified nations, was now reduced to a crawl. The roots of this crisis stretched far beyond the battlefield. Germany had no great oil reserves of its own. From the very start of the war, the Reich had relied on capturing resources: Romanian oil fields, Soviet territories, and synthetic fuel plants that worked day and night to squeeze gasoline from coal. Yet these lifelines were fragile. Allied bombers targeted synthetic plants relentlessly, reducing output to a fraction of what was needed. Romanian oil fields, once a pillar of German strategy, fell under constant Allied attack, turning the lifeblood of the Reich into a smoking ruin. By mid-1944, the problem had grown catastrophic. German divisions preparing for battle often received orders to limit tank movements to a bare minimum. Training exercises were slashed. New tanks, rolled out from factories with fresh paint and untested engines, sat useless because the fuel to drive them to the front did not exist. Soldiers joked bitterly that they had the weapons of war, but not the means to use them. The crisis gnawed at morale. Letters from the front revealed the despair of men who saw their fighting ability crippled not by the enemy's weapons, but by empty fuel cans. "We fight with what little we have," one soldier wrote, while the Americans seemed to drown in gasoline. Another remarked grimly, "Our tanks are lions without teeth, they look fearsome, but they cannot bite." Hitler himself grew obsessed with securing new sources of oil. He gambled in the east, driving the Wehrmacht deep into the Caucasus in search of fuel fields, only to meet disaster at Stalingrad. He ordered desperate counterattacks in Western Europe, hoping to capture Allied supply depots. But nothing could solve the problem. The Reich was bleeding fuel faster than it could ever replenish. By 1944, German commanders knew the truth: their armies were fighting a losing battle. Not because of courage or tactics, but because the gasoline that powered modern war had run dry. While Germany's soldiers struggled with empty fuel tanks and hollow stomachs, the Americans seemed to live in another world altogether. The scale of America's supply machine was something Europe had never witnessed before. It was not just an army that had landed on the beaches of Normandy, it was a vast industrial empire on wheels, rolling forward in an endless chain. The foundation of this machine was the Atlantic supply line. From the factories of Detroit and the oil fields of Texas, convoys of Liberty ships carried the lifeblood of war across the ocean. Every day, fleets of these ships braved the U-boat threat, carrying gasoline in drums, fuel in massive tankers, trucks, jeeps, rations, ammunition, and spare parts. To the German High Command, the sheer tonnage was staggering. What Germany might produce in a month, America delivered in a single week. But the true marvel came once those supplies reached Europe. On French soil, the Allies built an astonishing logistical artery known as the Red Ball Express. It was a round-the-clock convoy system, manned largely by African-American truck drivers who became the unsung heroes of the campaign. From ports and depots, thousands of trucks roared forward in tightly organized columns, delivering fuel, food, and ammunition to the front. They drove day and night, headlights covered, engines roaring, with little rest and no margin for error. Within weeks, the Red Ball Express was moving thousands of tons of supplies every single day, enough to keep entire armies marching. German soldiers who observed these convoys could hardly believe their eyes. Prisoners of war later described the shock of seeing lines of trucks that seemed to have no end. It was as if the road itself was alive, one captured officer admitted. Where one convoy ended, another began. To men who rationed every drop of gasoline, the sight of Americans burning fuel without hesitation, sometimes even pouring it away when trucks broke down, was unimaginable. The Americans also mastered the art of improvisation. Engineers laid down temporary pipelines under the English Channel to pump fuel directly from Britain to France. Portable depots sprang up overnight in captured towns. Repair crews kept trucks rolling with ruthless efficiency. If a vehicle broke down, it was pushed aside and replaced instantly. The priority was speed, volume, and continuity. To German eyes, it looked like madness. To the Allies, it was genius. Perhaps the most shocking detail for the Germans was how casually the Americans treated abundance. Soldiers smoked cigarettes from cartons, ate meals that looked like feasts compared to German rations, and seemed to have a replacement for everything: new boots, new uniforms, endless ammunition. One German diary entry captured the despair: "We are starving, they are feasting. We conserve, they waste. How can we fight this?" The truth was brutal. The American war effort was not limited to tactics and weapons. It was a contest of production. Factories in the United States ran day and night, churning out trucks, planes, tanks, and fuel in numbers the Reich could never match. Every convoy that rolled through France was the proof of a larger reality: America's industrial power had entered the battlefield. For German soldiers watching this tide, it was not just a supply line. It was the crushing weight of inevitability, the knowledge that their enemy had resources without end, and the will to deliver them wherever the war demanded. War is fought not only with bullets and tanks, but also with belief. By 1944, German soldiers had begun to lose something far more critical than equipment: hope. The sight of America's endless convoys rolling across France and Belgium delivered a psychological blow that was deeper than any artillery barrage. On the front lines, men whispered in disbelief about the supplies their enemy enjoyed. German infantrymen, surviving on watery soup and stale bread, saw American soldiers eating canned meat, chocolate, and fresh fruit from supply crates. While they stretched a single ration to last days, the Americans consumed their meals with ease and often discarded what they did not finish. To a starving soldier, this abundance was more terrifying than machine guns. Fuel shortages made the contrast even more unbearable. Panzer crews rationed every liter of gasoline, sometimes pushing their tanks by hand to conserve fuel. In stark contrast, American Sherman tanks maneuvered freely, refueled daily by convoys that seemed to appear from nowhere. German officers recorded their men's despair. The Americans drive as if the fuel comes from an ocean. We, meanwhile, cannot move an inch without fear of running dry. Letters and diaries captured the bitterness. One soldier confessed, "It is not their numbers that break us, but their resources. They fight without limits." Another wrote with quiet resignation, "We are men fighting a machine. We bleed while it continues without pause." For many, the realization that the Reich could not compete in logistics was the first step toward acknowledging inevitable defeat. The psychological strain went beyond hunger and fuel. It eroded discipline and morale. Soldiers questioned their commanders, asking how victory was possible when the enemy seemed inexhaustible. Rumors spread quickly. Stories of American trucks stretching beyond the horizon, of supply depots stacked higher than houses, of fuel dumps so vast they could burn for days without running dry. Whether exaggerated or not, such stories crushed the will to resist. Even captured German officers admitted the hopelessness. When interrogated, they often spoke not of battlefield defeats, but of the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. One colonel remarked, "Our men do not fear their weapons. They fear their supplies." For the German soldier, the realization was devastating. Bravery, training, and sacrifice could no longer balance the scales. Every time they destroyed a tank, another rolled in to replace it. Every time they captured supplies, 10 more convoys were already on the road. Fighting such an enemy felt like striking a mountain with bare hands. By the end of 1944, morale in many German units had collapsed. The men still fought, out of duty, fear, or habit, but deep down they knew the truth. They were not merely outnumbered, they were outsupplied, outfed, and outfueled. The psychological weight of America's infinite convoys was a weapon in itself, one that no German soldier could escape. The war in 1944 was shaped as much by fuel shortages as by bullets. Germany's struggle for oil and America's endless supply lines collided directly in the great battles of that year. Again and again, the outcome hinged not on courage or tactics alone, but on the ability to keep machines moving. One of the clearest examples was the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. After the breakout from Normandy, German forces tried desperately to retreat eastward. Yet their escape was crippled by a lack of fuel. Panzer divisions stalled on the roadside, their tanks abandoned when gasoline ran out. Soldiers who might have escaped were forced to flee on foot, leaving behind weapons and vehicles. Allied convoys, meanwhile, poured fuel into the advancing armies, allowing them to maintain relentless pressure. The Falaise Pocket became a graveyard of the German army, not just because of Allied firepower, but because engines sputtered dry at the worst possible moment. Another defining moment came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler staked everything on this desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied armies and seize Antwerp. But the plan had a fatal flaw: it depended on capturing Allied fuel. German armored divisions surged forward in the opening days, but they carried only limited reserves. As American convoys rushed to resupply their troops, German tanks began to sputter and stall. Some crews abandoned their machines after running out of fuel in the middle of battle. Others attempted to siphon gasoline from civilian vehicles or captured Allied trucks. The offensive, powerful at first, ground to a halt largely because the Reich could not feed its engines. Fuel shortages also crippled the Luftwaffe during these crucial battles. German pilots, many of them skilled veterans, were forced to ration flight hours so severely that they could not contest Allied air superiority. While American and British planes flew constant sorties, refueled again and again from endless supplies, German aircraft sat unused. This imbalance allowed Allied bombers to pound German positions and further disrupt already fragile supply lines. For the Americans, the story was the opposite. Their convoys delivered fuel at astonishing speed, even under fire. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Red Ball Express adapted instantly, rerouting supplies to reinforce threatened sectors. Truck drivers, many of them young and exhausted, worked day and night to keep fuel flowing. The result was decisive. American tanks rolled back into action, while German machines rusted where they stood. The psychological impact of these battles was enormous. German soldiers realized that bravery and planning meant little when their tanks could not move. Officers who had once boasted of lightning war now saw their divisions stranded. At Falaise, fuel shortages trapped entire units for destruction. At the Bulge, fuel turned an ambitious gamble into disaster. In both cases, the outcome was clear: fuel was not just a resource, it was the lifeblood of victory. The Allies had it in abundance. Germany did not. Each convoy of American trucks, each line of fuel drums, became as decisive as any battlefield maneuver. By the close of 1944, German soldiers understood the harsh truth. They could still fight with courage, but they could not fight without fuel. And against an enemy with convoys that seemed infinite, every battle was already tilted toward defeat. Behind every Allied advance in 1944 was a hidden army of drivers, mechanics, and engineers who kept the supply machine alive. For them, the war was not fought in trenches or in the cockpits of planes, but on the winding roads of Europe. Their battlefield was the endless convoy. The most famous of these efforts was the Red Ball Express, launched in August 1944. It was a lifeline that stretched hundreds of miles, moving fuel, food, and ammunition from the French coast to the front lines. The system worked like a conveyor belt. Trucks drove in long columns, day and night, along designated one-way roads. Once they unloaded at the front, they raced back to pick up more cargo. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved nearly 12,000 tons of supplies every day, an achievement without precedent in modern war. Most of the drivers were young, many of them African-American soldiers who found themselves in a segregated army but carried a burden that few recognized at the time. Their work was exhausting and dangerous. They drove under blackout conditions, headlights covered to avoid detection. They pushed through rain, fog, and mud, often sleeping only a few hours before being ordered back behind the wheel. Some recalled being so fatigued that they tied themselves to their seats to avoid collapsing while driving. German forces knew these convoys were vital and did everything they could to disrupt them. Fighter aircraft swooped down on columns of trucks, strafing with machine guns. Ambushes from scattered German units threatened isolated convoys. Mines and artillery shells turned quiet roads into death traps. Yet the drivers pushed forward. If a truck broke down, it was shoved off the road and the convoy continued. Nothing was allowed to stop the flow. Despite the dangers, there was also a sense of pride among the men. They understood that without them, the tanks could not roll, the planes could not fly, and the soldiers at the front could not eat. One driver later recalled, "We weren't fighting with rifles, but we knew the war depended on us." The convoys themselves became symbols of Allied strength. Long lines of trucks, stretching for miles, thundered across the countryside with engines roaring and dust rising. Villagers along the routes watched in amazement as the mechanical flood rolled by, a display of industrial might unmatched in history. For the Germans who occasionally glimpsed these convoys, the effect was crushing. They saw not just trucks, but the proof that America's resources were limitless. Each passing vehicle was another reminder that their own army, starved of fuel and supplies, could not hope to compete. In the end, the life of the convoy driver was one of endurance, courage, and sacrifice. These men fought a different kind of battle, against fatigue, enemy attacks, and the unforgiving road, but their role was no less decisive. Without their relentless effort, the Allied armies would have stalled in France. With them, the march to Germany became unstoppable. As the war drew to its bitter end, the reactions of German soldiers and officers to America's supply system became increasingly candid. What they saw on the battlefields of 1944 and 1945 left a deep impression that many carried into captivity and beyond. Captured German prisoners often spoke less about the fearsome weapons of the Allies and more about their logistics. During interrogations, POWs admitted that the sight of American convoys had broken their confidence. "We did not believe such abundance was possible," one officer confessed. "Every road was filled with their trucks, every village became a depot. We had nothing to match it." Memoirs written after the war echo the same sense of awe and despair. Generals such as Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein later acknowledged that logistics, not strategy, sealed Germany's fate. Guderian observed that while German industry struggled to produce enough tanks, America not only built them in vast numbers but also ensured they reached the front in record time. Manstein reflected bitterly that, "Our men fought with courage, but against an enemy who possessed the oil of the world." Ordinary soldiers felt this reality even more acutely. Diaries recovered from the front reveal bitter comparisons between German scarcity and Allied abundance. "They throw away what we would kill to have," one infantryman wrote. "They burn fuel as if it grows from the earth." Another soldier described his despair after capturing an abandoned American truck. "Its tanks were full. We could not believe they left it behind with so much fuel. For us, a single barrel meant survival." Hitler's obsession with securing oil underscored this awareness. His push into the Caucasus, his desperation to hold Romania's oil fields, and even his gamble during the Battle of the Bulge all revolved around fuel. Yet German soldiers came to realize these efforts were doomed. Against the Allied ocean of supplies, every German measure looked like a drop in the sand. For many POWs, the war's outcome became clear long before surrender. The convoys they had witnessed convinced them that Germany could not win. As one captured officer summed it up, "We were defeated not in the field, but on the road." Their convoys were endless. Ours had stopped. By the final months of 1944, the outcome of the war in Western Europe was no longer in doubt. The Wehrmacht still fought with determination, but its lifeblood had run dry. What had once been a swift, mobile force was now reduced to desperate defenses, its tanks immobile, its planes grounded, its soldiers exhausted. The decisive factor was not just battlefield skill or bravery, it was the flow of fuel and supplies. America's infinite convoys had achieved something remarkable. They turned the industrial might of an ocean-spanning nation into a weapon as devastating as any bomb or tank. The Red Ball Express and countless other supply lines were not glamorous, but they were relentless. They gave Allied armies the ability to fight without pause, to recover from setbacks, and to strike again with renewed strength. For the Germans, every passing convoy was a reminder that their fight had become hopeless. The legacy of this logistical dominance is still felt today. Military historians often quote the adage, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics." The campaigns of 1944 proved its truth beyond doubt. While German generals dreamed of bold maneuvers, their armies withered without fuel. Meanwhile, the Allies understood that no victory could be secured without the steady hum of engines on the road, carrying supplies forward mile by mile. For the men who witnessed it, the memory was unforgettable. German prisoners carried home tales of American abundance, stories of convoys stretching farther than the eye could see. American veterans remembered the endless grind of the drivers, mechanics, and engineers who made it possible. The war in Europe was not only won by those who charged into battle, but also by those who kept the fuel flowing. In the end, Germany was defeated not just by superior numbers or weapons, but by a truth as old as war itself: armies march on their stomachs, and, in the modern age, on their fuel. The Reich had run dry. America had not. The roar of convoys across the roads of France and Belgium was the sound of victory, echoing louder than gunfire. For the German soldier who watched those endless trucks roll past, disbelief gave way to resignation. The war was over, even if the fighting had not yet stopped. And in that realization lay the true power of America's supply machine. It broke not only tanks and planes, but the very will of its enemy.